On behalf of the staff of the Tamarack District Library and the Friends, we'd like to welcome you here today to our program. We thank you for coming. Out of respect for Dr. Butter, if you would please keep your mask on during the program, we would greatly appreciate it. There are books for sale out in the foyer. They are $20 each, and you can get them autographed afterwards. We ask that you hold all your questions till the end. She will be taking some questions in the end. And we appreciate your patience with all of this. Irene Butter is a well-known peace activist, Holocaust survivor, and Professor Emerita of Public Health at the University of Michigan. She is a frequent and favored inspirational speaker, talking about her experience during World War II and stressing the importance of never a bystander and that one person can make a difference. Irene is co-founder of Zaytuna, an organization of Jewish and Arab women working for peace, and a founder of the Raoul Wallenberg Project at the University of Michigan, which honors the Swedish diplomat who saved thousands of Jews with fellowships and an annual award for peace workers such as the Dalai Lama, Elie Wiesel, Desmond Tutu. She received a PhD in economics from Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Butter.
I'm going to try to stand up, but I'm glad there's a chair in case I want to sit down. And I've taken off my mask because I think you'll hear me better without it. You hear me now? Okay. Well, I just want to thank the library for inviting me. I feel honored and very pleased to be here. And it's always a pleasure to be at any event that is related to Anne Frank and her legacy. So I will just begin by saying that I grew up as a Jewish child in Nazi-occupied Europe, and I will tell you my story. I'll just preface it by the Frank family came from Germany to Holland in the late 30s in order to escape Hitler, and my family had the same route. We also came from Germany to Amsterdam. We lived in the same neighborhood, Anne and I. We didn't know each other very well. We didn't go to the same schools. But I had a friend who was a very good friend of Anne's, and I heard lots of stories about her in my childhood. So now I'm going to take you on my journey, and I have a map to begin with, so you'll get an idea of all the places that were part of my stops of my journey. Now, this wasn't a voluntary journey. This was a journey that was forced in one way or another. So I was born in Berlin, and that's somewhere where you see the first circle. And I had a very happy childhood, which I'll talk about more. And then from Berlin, when I was 7 years old, my family left for Amsterdam in order to escape Hitler. And so the first 2 years in the Netherlands were very happy years, but then the Nazis invaded the Netherlands and they took over everything and became an occupied country, and life changed drastically for all the Jews and for others as well. So those were the first 2 years, and then about a year or two after the invasion, my family was deported to a camp called Westerbork, and that's the third circle on the map, and that was a German concentration camp, a transit camp in the So from Westerbork, we were deported to Camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. And actually, that is where I met Anna, only one brief moment. And I'll talk about that later. And then from Camp Bergen-Belsen, we came to a town called Biberach in Germany, in southern Germany, and that has a very special significance in my life, which I will talk about later. And from there, I was on a train through Switzerland and France and ended up in a refugee camp in Algiers in North Africa, and that was before the war had ended. So that's another part of the story. Now, next slide, please. So I'll tell you about my family a little bit. This is my parents' wedding picture. They got married in Berlin. And the next slide, and this is my brother, 2 years older than I, and myself when we were little kids. And I lived with my parents, my brother, and my very loving grandparents. The first 7 years of my life, I lived in the same house as my grandparents, and there on the next slide. So you can see my grandfather holding my brother as a baby, and my grandmother holding me. And they were a really important part of my childhood. They played games with us. They were very loving. They spoiled us. My grandfather, on Sundays, he would get up early, and he would get us up and make breakfast, and everybody else in the family would sleep. And they would take us to the zoo, which was nearby, very often. And also, one of my favorite memories was when I was quite little, he had a little garden plot that he rented because we lived in a big city. And one day he wanted to show us what makes things grow. And he planted some seeds in the soil. And then he took us on a walk. And then when we came back, we saw cucumbers and radishes. They had grown that quickly. So that was a lesson. And my grandmother, what I remember best about her, she would take me shopping and buy me fancy dresses that my mother wouldn't have bought. So that was also a way of spoiling. Next slide. Well, so when we moved to Amsterdam, we couldn't take all our possessions with us, but this is where we lived, on the 3rd floor. And we lived in the same neighborhood as Anne Frank, and she lived in a house that the architecture is really very similar. And she also lived on the 3rd floor. And that was how we lived. It was, for 2 years, it was a very happy life. The Dutch welcomed us. We were not discriminated against. In school, we weren't bullied because we weren't Dutch, or we didn't know the language very well. And in Holland, as you can see, everyone bicycles. Certainly in Amsterdam, you see that bicycle stand there. And so my family often went on weekends on trips with our bicycles to the country. And it really was a happy life until, of course, Hitler invaded the country, and then things began to change drastically. The next slide. So here's a typical school picture. I think every kid in Holland in elementary school had a picture like this, sitting at a desk, pen in the hand, some kind of picture or poster behind you. And Anna went to a different school, but she has the same kind of picture. And that was school life, and school life was happy. We had good teachers. We had a lot of fun. Next slide. So, as I said, after the occupation, life changed substantially. And there were many restrictions for the Jews, all kinds of restrictions, where Jews were not allowed in public. Now, this is a sign at one of the biggest parks in Amsterdam, but we weren't allowed to go to movies, to theaters, to swimming pools, museums. There were all kinds of restrictions. And eventually, we had to wear the Star of David on the left side of our clothing. You'll see it in the exhibition of Anne Frank as well. We had to wear that at all times, so it was very easy to identify who was a Jew. And other restrictions, there was a curfew. We weren't allowed to go to the homes of people who were not Jewish. Our non-Jewish friends couldn't come to our house. My best friend in elementary school was not Jewish, and so she and I could only play on the street. We couldn't be in each other's homes anymore. And as time went on, things got worse. We couldn't go to the grocery store until after 3 in the afternoon, but it was wartime, and there were many scarcities, and at 3 o'clock there wasn't much food left in the store, so that was another more than an inconvenience. And then Jewish kids were expelled from the public schools and had to go to Jewish schools, and the Jewish school was much further from my home. We were not allowed to use public transportation, and at one point they took away our bicycles. All Jews had to turn in their bicycles. And so, can you imagine if you can't take any public transportation and they take away your bicycle, you're very limited where you can go after that. And so on and so forth. Eventually, the worst of all, of course, was the deportation. And the goal of Hitler was to eliminate all Jews, to make the world free of Jews. And this came to Amsterdam as well. Many people started being deported. And that's the time when Anne Frank and her family went into hiding. And in one sense, they were very lucky because there was a hiding place in the building of Anne's father's business. But many people found it much more difficult to find a hiding place. On the other hand, while they were there for a long time, almost 2 years, they were betrayed and they were deported. So it was a very difficult decision. Should you try to go into hiding, or should you just go with the flow and go to a concentration camp and hope that you will survive? So my family did not go into hiding, and might as well say that now in Anna's family, the father was the only one who survived. The mother and Anna and her sister did not survive. And in my family, my father was the only one who did not survive, but my mother and my brother and I did. So, Sophie's choice. How do you know what is the right choice in circumstances like that? So, to continue, this is called a razzia, and that was a word the Germans invented, or I don't know, the word may have existed a long time. This is what happened when the Nazis came to your neighborhood, and they went from house to house and from door to door looking for Jews, and then they gave you 10 minutes to pack your belongings, and you had to leave your home, and the only thing you could take with you is what you could carry on your back. And so you can see the picture here, all kinds of people, young and old, babies, all kinds of bundles. Some people have suitcases, some people have backpacks, some people just have bundles. And here we are being marched to a square where they gathered all the Jews from that neighborhood. And in front here you see 2 coffee cups. And some time ago I read that, of course, there were 2 people with these coffee cups, and they were sitting at the window having their coffee and looking at what was going on outside. So it took some time, but one very hot day in June, the Nazis came to my neighborhood, and we were, just like that, we were taken to a square, and they gathered hundreds of people that day in that neighborhood. And then when they had pretty much covered the whole neighborhood, they brought trucks, and they took us into trucks to the railway station. And the next slide shows the train. Now, this is the train we saw at the railroad station, and this is how Jews were transported to concentration camps. Sometimes 60, 70 or more people in one wagon, squeezed together like sardines in a can. There wasn't even room for everyone to sit on the floor. Some people had to sit on each other's laps. And in our case, the trip to Westerbork took about 6 or 7 hours, but the people who were transported to the concentration camps in Eastern Europe sometimes spent 2 or 3 days in a wagon like this. There was no air, no food, no water, no toilet, and some people died the transportation. So this is how it was, and when the wagon was full, they would close the door, they would lock it. There were no windows, so it was very uncomfortable. And this train took us to Camp Westerbork, which is the next slide. And this gives you some idea what the barracks were on the left, and the right side shows you how we slept. There were 3-tier bunk beds, and the only thing on the bed was a straw mattress. And the only space you had for your own belongings would be 1/3 of the floor underneath the bed. The barracks were very crowded, and of course people were very agitated to have been taken away from their homes, from all their belongings, from family. Life was not pleasant. Now the adults had work. It wasn't very heavy labor, but everyone had a job, everyone had to go to work. And at that point, I was 12 years old. There was no schooling of any kind. There were no libraries, there were no books, there were no toys, no playgrounds. There wasn't anything to do. And so life was boredom most of the time. The food, looking at it from retrospect, it wasn't all that bad. They did give you 3 meals a day. It wasn't like my mother's cooking, but it was edible food. It's not that we had an awful lot of food, but sometimes you were able to receive a package if there was anyone left who had some food to send you, and that was always a very happy occasion. Now, the next thing that happened in Westerbork was, and I have to go back a little bit, one day in Amsterdam when we were still there, my father met a friend on the street, and he was very cheerful because he had just received passports for him and his wife, and he gave my father the name and address of the person in Stockholm and in Sweden who had sent the passports. And my father immediately got 4 passport pictures and sent a very brief letter to this man. It was obvious why my father would be writing to him. And of course, the purpose was to get passports for my family. But the passports didn't arrive before we were deported. And this is just a passport picture, and it had to expose your left ear. for identity purposes, and I've never been able to figure out why the left ear is a part of your identity, but that was the rule. What I'm getting to is that one day, and maybe that was the only day that I saw a smile on my parents' faces, a package came with 4 passports to Ecuador. And it was a miracle in a way, because we didn't get any mail forwarded to us from our home address. But here was this package, and it was of major importance, because once we had those passports, we were not just Jews who would be transported to Auschwitz or another camp in Eastern Europe, but we became exchange Jews. And that was related to a policy that the Germans had formulated, that they were going to keep certain Jews kind of in reserve to exchange them for German citizens who were in North America or anywhere else, and maybe some prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, and they would exchange them for the Jews with passports. So they were going to be used for commerce, in a way, for an exchange purpose. But that meant everything for people who were in Westerbork, because in Westerbork, every week, a train came, a cattle car train, and the camp was built. The railway track was right smashed through the center of the camp. One side of the camp was on one side, the other on the other side. Wherever you went, you had to cross the railway track. And that train would come every Saturday, and it would be a long, long cattle car train, and it would sit there the rest of Saturday, all day Sunday, all day Monday. And no matter where you wanted to go, you would see that ominous train and wonder. And then that night, Monday night at 11 o'clock, the barrack leaders would turn on the light, and they would read a list of names of the people who were to go on the train that night. So every Monday night was filled with anxiety. And then after you listened for your own name, and if you were lucky the name was not on the list, then my parents and my brother and I, we'd always get dressed and go to other barracks and look up our relatives or friends or neighbors. And there was always somebody who had to go on that miserable train. And then you'd spend the rest of the night until they had to board the train, and you would say goodbye. And you pretty much knew you weren't going to see them again. So every Monday night was this drama, and every week was a cycle, the same. After the train left, you didn't know what would happen the next Monday night. So you were always in anxiety, because this was the way of life in Westerbork. So we were there in this camp for 8 months. And then one day they said we were going to go to another camp, the Bergen-Belsen in Germany, and that was called an exchange camp. And it would be better than Westerbork, they said, and you wouldn't be there very long because you're going to be exchanged. You're going to go to America. And so that day, they transported us on a regular train, a person's train, and we had our own compartment, and the train left late in the evening, so we traveled through the night. And we were kind of optimistic because it was a regular train, which Jews hadn't seen for quite a while. And then we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, and it was very scary. The Nazis were at the track, and they yelled at us, they screamed at us. We got out of the train. We had to march through a forest for about maybe 1.5 miles, and then we came to the camp. And this is what it looked like. Next slide. This is what we saw when we came there. Well, the barracks were not so different from Westerbork, but the people standing at the barbed wire fence, they looked so skinny, they looked so their clothes looked like rags, anxious expressions on their faces. That was our first impression. And so we thought, how could this be a better camp? But here we were. And so eventually we were assigned to a barrack, and life there was really, really brutal in Bergen-Belsen. The adults had hard slave labor, actually, 6.5 days of the week. So many of them leaving the camp, working on construction or working in factories and doing all kinds of work, pulling apart old underwear so the good fabric could be used to sew new underwear, and pulling apart shoes so new shoes could be made out of the good leather, and all kinds of jobs. My brother, too, had to do this. They had to get up early in the morning, and they had to go to roll call. Roll call was one form of torture in Bergen-Belsen, because they lined you up on a big square in columns of 5. You had to stand still. You couldn't talk. You couldn't jump. You couldn't sit down on the ground. You couldn't do anything. And they had to come up with a certain number of people, and they never seemed to be able to reach that correct number. And so we stood there many days for hours and hours, rain or shine. It really was torture. And so the next slide will show you, see on the left side there, that is what was called the Appellplatz. That's where we were like rows and columns, and you couldn't talk, you couldn't do anything. And if the Nazis saw somebody who sat on the floor, one time I saw an elderly lady, she couldn't stand up anymore, she sat on the floor, and they came and they beat her to death. Just as an example, that as a signal, don't do that, because that's what's going to happen to you. Well, so labor was hard. The people who didn't go to work had to stay on this square during the day. Sometimes there was punishment, and this would take place twice or 3 times a day, because they claimed they couldn't get to the right number. Food was minimal. Each day we got a piece of bread about this wide, and in the evening there was soup, and it was always turnips boiled in water. If you were lucky, you found a little piece of potato in it, but mostly it was turnips boiled in water. Nobody can survive on a food ration like that, certainly not doing heavy labor. In addition, the hygienic conditions were atrocious, and there were epidemics. Here, everybody had low resistance. There was cholera, there was polio, dysentery, all kinds of diseases. Typhus was the most common disease, which was most fatal, I think, more than other diseases. And we all had lice, body lice, and body lice carried the disease from one person to another. So here you have the combination of starvation, malnutrition, epidemics, living close, very, very close together, and everybody having lice that transmit these diseases. So the death rate in Bergen-Belsen was very high. And when the Allies liberated Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, they came at a time when the ground was just littered with dead bodies, because people hadn't known what. There was just a small crematorium. They didn't even know how to handle dead bodies, and they were lying all over the ground there. So that was the scene pretty much. We saw my parents becoming sicker and sicker. My mother turned ill at one point, and she couldn't get out of bed anymore. And that was her condition for several months. I was taking care of her. My responsibilities were to take care of the children whose parents were out for labor, and to keep the barracks clean. and to do the laundry for my family. Now, doing laundry meant dragging your clothing through cold water. There was no hot water, there was no soap. There was really no way to clean the clothes, but that's all you could do, is use cold water, hang them up on a wash line outside, and if you didn't sit there to watch your clothes, then you would never see them again, because there were so many thieves who would take anything they could get their hands on. But even worse than the clothing thieves were the bread thieves, because everybody was starving. And at night, these bread thieves, they would sneak around, and if they could find any piece of bread that a person had with him or herself in bed, trying to save it for the next day, then it would get stolen. So that was a serious problem. Stealing from somebody who has no more than you do is definitely, it's understandable, but it's not moral. So here you can see, as the camp got more and more crowded, two people had to share a bed. And so here you see in there very narrow beds. My brother shared a bed, and my mother and I shared a bed. And that's how close and congested we lived. We were sent to Bergen-Belsen to be exchanged, but we were there almost 1 year at this camp, waiting for the day to be exchanged, and barely surviving under those conditions. But one day in January of 1945, 11 months after we arrived there was an announcement that there would be a group of people who would leave the camp and be exchanged. And you had to report to a Nazi doctor at a certain place to be included in the group that would leave the camp. And so my brother and I, we went first. No, first we tried to get my mother out of bed and have her walk, but she couldn't. And then my brother said, well, you and I better go, because this is probably the only chance we'll ever have to get out of this camp. So we did, and we got approved by the Nazi doctor. And then we went back to the barrack. My father was out at labor that day, and when he finally came back, he looked very ill. And he said he wasn't feeling well, and we of course wanted him to go to this Nazi doctor, and he said he couldn't, he had to rest. After a while, we begged him, and leaning on me heavily, he did go. When we came to this place, it was just a table with the Nazis having lists of names. And so the Nazi doctor said, are you John Hasenberg? He said, yes. He said, are you sick? He said, no. How, the way he looked, how could he not be sick? And then he looked at me, and he said, okay, well, the four of you better get ready tomorrow, because you'll leave the camp. So that was another miracle. A 14-year-old girl. Could I have looked like my mother, who was in her 50s? But, we were all so skinny. We wore rags. She must have been taller than I was at age 14. But anyway, was he being human to allow us as a family to leave the camp, or was it just he really thought I was my mother? But he crossed off the names, and then the next day the big challenge was, how could we get my mother to the train? But we had friends there who were very kind and carried her, and so eventually the four of us, and this was a Red Cross train, and so that already gave us hope that maybe we weren't just being sent to another concentration camp, which often happened. And here was a Red Cross train. It was heated. We got real food, and it left Bergen-Belsen in January of 1945. Next slide. Well, this is, a student made this picture, the Red Cross train, the good train. And then what happened on the train is that the second night, my father died. Here, we were so close to freedom, but he just couldn't make it. And so his body was taken off that train on the railway station of Biberach and put on a bench. And my mother, my brother, and I, we had no choice but to stay on the train. We didn't want to stay in Germany. I don't know what would have happened then. So at least he wasn't buried in one of those mass graves in the camp. But the journey went on. 2 days later, well, first at the border of Germany and Switzerland, the exchange actually took place on a railway platform. On the one side was the train with people from Bergen-Belsen, and the other side were German citizens who were forced to leave America to come back to Germany. And that's where it took place, and they had to match the right number. And so that when we arrived in Switzerland, my mother and my brother were so sick, they had to be taken to hospital immediately from the railroad track. And I was not allowed to stay with them. I wasn't sick enough to go to a hospital. And the Swiss were flooded with refugees, and they said they couldn't take any more. And so anybody who had to leave a sick relative in Switzerland was sent on. And that's how we ended up in North Africa in a refugee camp. The war had not ended, and certainly the camp was a lot better. Next slide. These are the only pictures I have of that camp. You can see the barracks there and a group of people taking a picture. And these were people, young people who hang out together. In the camp, we didn't have any responsibilities. We had freedom. We could do what we wanted. But of course, everybody wanted to go to their destination, France, Yugoslavia, or other countries they had come from. But most people went to America, the United States, some to South Africa, and some went to Palestine. But here we were waiting. First the war had to end, then we had to get visas to come to the United States because we weren't allowed to go to Ecuador. The passports actually were false, and they were only issued under two conditions: that we would never try to come to Ecuador, and that after the war we would have to return the passports. We didn't know that, but at least they got us out of the camp. And so here we were in Algiers. After the war ended, I was able to make contact with my mother and my brother. They were recovering, but we were never reunited. They couldn't come to North Africa, and I wasn't allowed to go to Switzerland to be with them. So at the end of 1 year, I came to the United States. I lived with relatives in New York City, and they couldn't come till 6 months later. So we were separated for 18 months, just after coming out of concentration camp. I have nightmares about what's happening at our borders, because it has too many memories and reminders, and that this is still happening. Next slide. So on the passage, this is a Liberty ship. Liberty ships were built in 48 hours during the war to support the troops in Europe. And somebody on the ship, an American doctor, told me that sometimes the ships break in half in the middle of the ocean, and the only part that gets there is the part with the engine. So It was all a joke, but I didn't know that. So this is I didn't believe it afterwards, but this is the picture of these ships sometimes broke. But anyway, I arrived in the United States, and my mother's cousins were wonderful. I was very eager to go to school. I hadn't been to school for 3.5 years, so I went to school pretty soon. Next slide. And that's my high school graduation picture. And the other picture is during my years in college. I was always working in summer resorts and hotels as a waitress, and that's just picture with, there were always all students, and you worked 7 days a week. You didn't have time to spend the money, but you had friends because we were all students doing the same work. Next slide. And so I was very lucky because I was able to go to a city college in New York, which was tuition free. And when my mother came to America, we were penniless. Everything had been taken away from us, and we didn't have a home, or we didn't have any belongings, and there was a housing shortage, so we didn't live together for another few months after they came to the United States. But so I was able to go to college tuition free and having jobs after school. My mother had to do unskilled labor because she had never worked before. My brother also had a job. And after college, I went to graduate school, Duke University, and this is my husband. We both got PhDs at Duke University, and this is, next one is a picture of my children. This is when they were very young. Now they have their own kids, and a daughter, she's the older one, and my son 2 years younger than she is. Next slide. And so this is the family. On top of my granddaughters, I used to read stories to them when they were little, and that's my grandson. And then these are 2 great-grandchildren, Adam and Maya. He's almost 3, and she's not quite 1.5. And then my other grandson lives in California, and I see him more often. He's 14 years old. And then there's another great-grandchild on its way to be born in December. So life definitely had its turn for the better, and I feel very lucky to have had a wonderful life afterwards. Next slide. Here I'm teaching economics at the University of Michigan. I've been retired for quite a while now. Next slide. And this is just a historic picture. I was working at the University of Michigan. This is in the 70s. It's graduation day. And in front you have all the students. They're all wearing suits and white shirts and ties, and they're all white. And then behind is the faculty. They're all men in their suits and their white shirts and their ties. And then over on the right side, that is me, the only person on the faculty. It wasn't easy, but it's a lot better now. The picture today, 50% of the faculty would be women, and probably more than 50% of the students. So that's why I like to show the picture. So good news. The next slide. Well, my brother has 2 children, and my 2 children, we were at a family reunion one day, and the kids ganged up on us, and they said they want us to take them to the sites of family history in Europe. And we were quite shocked because we had never thought we'd go back to any of that. But after giving it some thought, if we don't take them, who would? And so we made this trip in 1991, and we went to Berlin, we went to Amsterdam, Westerbork. This is Bergen-Belsen. And it was an amazing experience to go back to a place where you were supposed to be murdered and take your children and your grandchildren. So we were grateful that they pushed us to make this trip. The next slide. This is just a sign. The camp existed from 1940 to 45. Next slide. Here you see a mass grave. So it says 2,500 dead are buried there. And when the Allies came, they found the ground covered with dead bodies. They didn't know what to do, but to dig these trenches and bury them in mass graves. And they're all over the grounds there. And that's what you see. They don't have any barracks anymore, but they have mass graves, and they have a museum. They have an education center, so it's an amazing place to visit. Next slide. This is a marker for Margot and Anne Frank. Now, Anne Frank and her sister died in Bergen-Belsen, and they probably buried in a mass grave, but after the war, people came and put up these markers, and if you could look at it closely, you see all kinds of stones and shells and jewelry and little doll that people leave there when they visit. Next slide. And so then we went to Biberach, to a town called Laupan, where my father is buried in a Jewish cemetery after the war, and went there with our children and grandchildren. And it's a beautiful cemetery, and I've been there about 6 times to visit the grave. And they're wonderful people taking care of the cemetery. And maybe I'll be able to go one more time. We'll see. Next slide. So I've been involved with a project at the University of Michigan. This is a picture of Raoul Wallenberg, who is, in my opinion, the greatest World War II hero. He was a Swede, and he came from an aristocratic, very wealthy family. He's not a Jew. He studied at the University of Michigan from 1931 to 1935, and then went back to Europe. And in 1944, he was sent to Budapest in Hungary to try to save the last substantial Jewish population that still existed. And he's said to have saved tens of thousands of Jews from being sent to the death camps by making out passports for them, and also building safe houses and declaring them Swedish property that the Nazis could not enter. So he saved a lot of people. And unfortunately, at the end of the war, he was captured by the Russians and never seen or heard of again. So that's a very sad ending to someone who saved so many lives. And so at the University of Michigan, I helped build an endowment. And every year, until the pandemic, every year we had a world-renowned speaker who fights for peace and justice and ending discrimination to come to campus and meet students and give a talk, and they receive a medal. It's called the Raoul Wallenberg Medal, and we are now 20 years old, so we've had 20 medalists, and also other fellowships that we give to students who have this same perspective and openness of mind to try to save discriminated, oppressed people in one way or another. So that's the project. And then the next slide. This is the Dalai Lama was one of the people who received the Wallenberg Medal when he came to campus a long time ago. Next slide. These are some of the other medalists who came. Mitrice was the person who took care of the Frank family, and she's mentioned a lot in Anna Frank's diary, and she got the medal and came to Ann Arbor, and this is the first time I got to meet her, and she was an amazing person to take the risks of sheltering a Jewish family, which she could have been killed herself just doing that. And then the man on top there is Paul Rusesabagina. He was a hero of the Rwandan genocide and a person from Thailand who tries to rescue abused women. And on the bottom there's Per Unger. He was an ambassador in Budapest with Raoul Wallenberg at that time. So they're all amazing people, and it's been a privilege to host them and get to know them. And hopefully when this pandemic is over, we can start inviting more wonderful people. And the next slide, this is a tuna. It's a group of Jewish and Palestinian women, and we're almost 20 years old. One more year. We started meeting every other week in our homes, and our theme, which is refusing to be enemies, and showing other people how enriching that can be. And the last slide, that's my memoir. It was published in 2018. There's some copies, I believe, here, which I'll be happy to sign. And second edition of my book's coming out later on this month. So I'm happy that it's also been translated into 4 languages. So it's getting out into the world. And thank you all for coming and listening. Thank you. I'll be glad to. Any question is fine.
Anyone have any questions? Is there a question from anyone? Something you'd like to know? Yes, Steve?
Well, I had a question about your father's body left at the platform. Who took care of it so that he could have that decent burial?
Well, he was first buried in this town where the train stopped, in a Christian cemetery. And then after the war ended, some people knew that he was Jewish, and they saw to it that he would be transferred to a Jewish cemetery in a town about 12 kilometers away.
That was within the bounds of Germany, though, right?
In Germany,
Yeah.
right, yes.
Nice to know of those people who took that concern.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead, sir.
When did you find out that the Allies had invaded France in June of 44?
Well, we had very little news in the concentration camp, but eventually something leaked through and we found out about it, but that was a long, long time before they reached Northern Europe. And we didn't get much news after that. No.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. We greatly appreciate that. I currently have an exchange student from Germany where I teach. And when I spoke to him that I was going to be meeting you and where you were held in the concentration camp, he said to assure you that his school takes them there every year to remember. And it was very touching to know that even though he's in Germany, America now, that he has a connection with you by going to that concentration camp. So.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of education in Germany, and I've met a lot of wonderful people. And Germany, I think, has done more than any other country to acknowledge what they did and to try to make up for that in whatever way they can. Thank you.
Hi. Yes, thank you for coming. I just loved your show and your story, but I was surprised to learn that I think you said you were never separated from your family the whole time you were incarcerated. How did that happen?
Well, because we were exchange Jews, and the Nazis didn't want to separate the families that were going to go out into the free world after the exchange.
So that was one of the benefits.
Yeah, but it's an exception.
So ill and then moved to the United States. Did she live a long time after that?
Yes, actually, she did. Thank you. She there were big scars for her, but she died at the age of 86.
How wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Where do you live right now?
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Ann Arbor.
How were you able to get out your pictures that you had of you and your brother and your parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had a neighbor in Amsterdam, not non-Jewish, and she was a photographer, and she was willing to keep our pictures for us. And she said, if the Nazis come into my home and see a lot of photos, I'm a photographer, so they can't punish me for that. And after the war, she returned them. So it's a big treasure.
Did you ever get back any of your possessions when you left all the things in Amsterdam?
Well, just a few that the neighbors kept for us, but they had a policy that when Jews were deported from their homes, they came with big vans and emptied it and took everything back to Germany.
What did your father do further?
He was a banker. He was my grandfather, my mother's father, owned a bank in Berlin. My father was his partner. And then when he went to Amsterdam to look for a job, he had a position with American Express Company in Amsterdam. But then when the Nazis took over, they weren't allowed to employ Jews anymore. So, yeah, he was a banker.
Go ahead, sir.
I was at a Jewish wedding many, many years ago, and sitting next to a Holocaust survivor, had the tattoo on the arm, and I asked her, what could we learn from your experiences? And she said, never trust anybody. And would you say that's a similar way of thinking or not?
Well, I wouldn't say that's the most important thing to learn, but I can understand a lack of trust when everything's been taken away from you, and even Jews steal from Jews in the concentration camp. You become very cautious about your possessions. But no, the most important lesson for me has been never be a bystander.
What did your mother do us for a living?
What'd she do after the war?
Yeah.
Well, my mother never worked before, so she had to take whatever job she could find, and she worked in factories, and then the last job she had, which she really liked, she was a cashier in a department store. It's a good question.
I have a brother-in-law that was in Belsen. He was from Poland, and he and his mom, his dad was killed when he was a little boy, his dog was killed, and he lost the upper part of his right ear. When you showed that picture of the left ear, it made me think he lost the top part of his right ear, and it's gone yet to this day when the bomb hit him. And so he was put in Belsen with his mom, and she would say farmers would come at night with turnips. He said, I had more turnip soup in my life than I ever had. She would make soup out of whatever the farmers threw over the fence. And that was in Poland, but he also was in Belsen. So I appreciate your story, and I want kids to know that this really happened because schools like to take it out of our history.
Well, there were no farmers in Belsen.
If I might just add an insight, and I pick it up from what you said about nightmares, sections at the borders. PBS is running a series right now, or at least a program about the detention camps, sometimes called concentration camps because of the concentration of people for their ethnicity, about what happened on the West Coast. And I saw in one of the pictures a mother with her children, and then the belongings that they could just carry with them from their houses and businesses they had to leave. And so I just wonder, as I thought of that picture, how many bystanders on the West Coast watched their neighbors carted away, though they were U.S. citizens, many of them having the rights of citizenship, but out of fear were taken from their homes to these places in the desert. It just makes me think that we don't know our history well enough. And I said to our librarian, as you were mentioning, the woman was saying about how children in Germany are given good lessons. How many of us have visited a camp where those citizens were detained because of their ethnicity? And how many school children go to those camps so they will know that part of our history? I just wanted to observe it, and if you wanted to say anything more, I encourage you about what gives you nightmares about our current willingness or unwillingness to receive refugees.
All over the world, countries don't want to have any more refugees enter, right? I mean, refugees is a bad word in those countries. And many of these are stateless. And we were also stateless because Hitler took away citizenship from all the German Jews. That's about the lowest status you can have in the world because no country has to admit you. And now we're in a situation where there's millions and millions, I think 16 or 17 million refugees all over the world, I've read, and nobody wants them. It's pretty grim.
I haven't heard you mention anything. What part of your Jewish faith would contribute to how you survived this?
Well, my family was not Orthodox, and I remember seeing Orthodox families in the barracks where I lived that observed the Sabbath on Friday night, and even if they didn't have candles and they didn't have food and they didn't have the wine for the blessings, they had the prayers and the songs, and I envied them. But it was not in my family history.
Do you have any suggestions for just an ordinary person who would want to help refugees?
Well, there are many organizations. The Highest is one of them. Locally, I think every region has a refugee absorption organization, and now so many refugees are coming from Afghanistan, so there will be many opportunities for their settlement. I know we in Ann Arbor have a settlement organization, and there are many ways of participating, helping them learn the language, furniture for their apartments, many, many ways one can help.
Our organization in Lansing, Lattice, is receiving 400 Afghans. They're there currently now. And I will just share with you that housing is the number one. It's very difficult in that area. They're looking for host families. They're looking for anything that we can extend to them. So I'd be happy to leave my contact information if anyone would like to reach out. Local schools are looking to do social projects all the time. Reach out to your local schools, let them have some of those fundraisers. It really does allow those kids the opportunity to know that they are not bystanders. They are participants in helping. So I would just recommend reaching out to your local schools.
Thank you.
How long did it take you, because you're so malnourished and stuff, how long did it take you to kind of get back into a better condition and even catch up in education?
Well, better health was a lot quicker than education, because when I was in this camp in Algiers, after the war ended, I wrote letters to my mother, and she saved them all, and about 2 or 3 months later, I told her how many pounds I had gained and that I needed to go on a diet. But education, of course, you know, when you're young, you can learn a language much faster. And I was so eager to go back to school. So I was able to do high school in 2.5 years and then go on to college. Yes.
How many languages do you speak?
Well, not really a lot of them. I learned German when I was, you know, it's my first language, but I really repressed it because I hated it so much because the experiences. And it took many, many years to be willing to speak it again and relearn it. I learned a little French in Algiers because it's a French-speaking country, but I didn't keep it up. But I still know my Dutch from the years in Holland and English.
Is your husband still living?
My mother, not anymore. My brother, no.
Your husband?
Oh, yes. But he wasn't in a concentration camp.
Any other questions? Oh, we have one over here.
So in the organization that you had up on the board with the Palestinian women, how does your organization interact with the Israeli government dealing with settlements or the Palestinian issue that is going on there, whether it be Gaza or the West Bank? And by the way, I want you to fill it home because there's at least one other Jewish person in here today.
Well, we don't interact with the government at all. And when we were first founded, when we first started 20 years ago, we had hope. Unfortunately, it has diminished a great deal about peace between Jews and Arabs, and that's what we're about. Refusing to be enemies, we have become very close friends after all these years, and we have many invitations. We use dialogue as a method of learning about each other and learning about the conflict and finding new understandings. And then also we have fundraising projects. So, for example, we have for the orphans in Gaza and widows, all kinds of, mostly, well, actually, we have a message that 1 year we contribute to Palestinian cause, 1 year we contribute to a Jewish peacemaking cause in Israel, and the third is local in our city, our community.
Thank you for being here with us today. Do you know why the Jewish people discriminated against? Was it religion or?
Well, there's been anti-Semitism forever. So they've been chosen as a scapegoat many, many centuries in many different places. And there may be many reasons.
Do we line up there for the signing, or is she coming out here?
The book signing will be in here. Is there any more questions?
I want to say that
Go ahead.
health-wise for her age, she's doing very well.
Yes.
And to have such a sharp memory.
Yes. We're thankful for that.
Thank you.
I think we have one more question.
How did you end up in Michigan from New York?
How did you end up in Michigan?
Well, my husband and I both got jobs at the University of Michigan. And so we've lived in Ann Arbor more than 50 years, and we're not moving.
Okay, Dr. Butter will sign books over here. We'll get her set up over here. If you could form just a line to come up, and she can sign your books there.
They're still telling you outside, you haven't gotten yet.
I can be relieved. How you doing?